things too. But for now, let's just take a look at this little curve or meniscus that the water's forming right in here. If you can kind of take a look then, that line is above 40, certainly. It's even above 41. So if you look really closely, this little line here, this one, represents 41 milliliters. We're going to assume this is measuring in milliliters or cubic centimeters. So here's 41, here's 42, here's 43. Now, let's say we're looking at that curve and we can all agree that it's more than 40. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's 40 something. And that something, it's definitely at least 41. And many of you will look at this and probably say that this line is actually right at or even slightly above the 42 line. Well, let's say we all agree. Now, if you don't, that's okay. We'll talk about you in a second here. Let's say that we all think, well, it's pretty close to 42. And you probably even would be comfortable if I gave you this graduated cylinder and said, what's the volume in here? You'd look at it and say, oh, it's about 42 milliliters. And you'd be accurate, but you wouldn't be as precise as you could be. And the reason for that is that the line, this little line, tells you 42. So any old person could look at that and say 42. But we need to be able to go one digit further than that because we need to be more precise. One decimal place more precise than what the device itself tells us. And it tells us 42. They don't mark that little line, but that's what it represents. So you need to go one decimal place further than that. So it's 42 point what? Well, let's say you look at this and said, well, I think it's just a little bit above 42. What you have to do is sort of imagine between 42 and 43, right in here, that there are actually 10 more small spaces in that little gap. Now, that's pretty small, and so you're kind of be estimating it, which is fine. Let's just say I'm going to be right a little bit above it, and so I might say that's 42.1, and you'd be good. That'd be precise enough. You can't go any further than that because then you'd be estimating 2 decimal places, and that's not allowed. You can only estimate 1. So I'm going to look at that and say 42.1. Now what if my lab partner comes over here and says, no. That's 42, but it's right on the money. So I don't think it's 42.1. I think it's 42.0, and that'd be fine as well. Well, let's say your third lab partner comes along and says, you're both wrong. And this is what I mentioned before, those of you who think that it's not even up to the 42 line yet. So let's erase that whole thing. And let's say, well, I'm a third person. I'm going to come along and say, you know, from my perspective, it's actually a little bit under the 42 line. And so I'm going to say it's only 41 point something. And I'm going to say that something is 9, so 41.9. So that's 3 different measurements, and you could actually be even a little bit more or less than that, and probably still be okay. But if I'd said 41.9, and someone else in my group thought it was exactly 42, and a third person said 42.1, well, we're all being accurate, because those are all reasonably close. We're all being equally precise, which is to 1 decimal place, to the 10th place. And we'd all be fine. These would all be correct answers. You could write those down on your lab table or on a sheet like this, and you'd be perfectly fine. Now, if you said 43.1, you'd be precise the way you should be, but you wouldn't be accurate because this isn't up to 43. And again, we always want to read, like I said before, the bottom of this curve, right at the lowest point. You can't read 43 be way up here. It's nowhere near that high. So if you're to say 43.1, your precision is good, but your accuracy is actually way off. If you were to say 41.1, again, your accuracy is off. If you're to say 42.15, you're accurate, but you're being actually more precise than you're allowed to be. And sometimes that sounds a little weird. Shouldn't we be as precise as we absolutely can? Well, you are when you only have 1 decimal place here, because that's all this allows. If I take a look at number 3, I'm going to clear out some of these other measurements just so I don't have all 3. You only need 1 answer, not all the possible answers. So really any of these would be all right. And they'd be just as correct on a quiz or anything else too. If I were to look at number 3, I'm above the 50, this is 55, 56, 57, 58, 59. I'd say I'm between 58 and 59, and probably so would you. So this is 58 point something, and that something is up to you to decide. Maybe I look at that and say, it's just about half, maybe not quite, so I'll say 58.4. Maybe you say it's 58.3 or 58.5 or something else, but it's going to be 58 point something. If we take a look over here at number 1 real quick, we can tell it's above 12, but this line then is not 13 because 13 is way up here, right? So if you can imagine that this line is 12.1, 12.2, 12.3, 12.4, and so on, then this line, this big one, actually is 12.0. Think about it, right? So that's 12.0. This one's 12.1, 12.2. So if I were to look at this, I would say it's above 12.1, which is this little guy right here. But it's not quite to 12.2, which is this one right here. And so it's between 12.1 and 12.2. I'm going to say it's 12.1 something. And again, that something is for you to decide or for your partners to decide on their own. I'm going to say it's just a little bit above 12.1, maybe not quite as little as it might be. So I'm going to say it's 12.1 and 2/100ths. Okay, right a little bit above. Maybe you say it's 12.11 or 12.13 or even 12.10. You'd want to have 2 decimal places because the lines themselves, as I sort of indicate here, the lines themselves represent the tenths place, 12.1, 12.2 on that device.